Well, welcome everyone and good evening. I'm Jean Mcelvain, the Interim Director and Associate Curator at the Goldstein Museum of Design here at the U of M, and we're delighted to have everyone here this evening. Before beginning, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota is located on traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of Indigenous people. The university resides on Dakota lands ceded in the treaties of 1837 and 1851. I'd also like to take a moment to say that all Goldstein programming is made possible in part by the voters of Minnesota through a Minnesota State Arts Board Operations Support Grant, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. We're also funded by generous donors, the College of Design, and a grant through the Royal Bank of Canada. So we are very fortunate and grateful to have these four amazing professionals with us here this evening. This panel was developed in collaboration with our current exhibition in the HGA Gallery, Say It Loud, and all panelists and our moderator are participants in this exhibition. Say It Loud is curated by New York-based architect Pascale Sablan, who is founder and executive director of Beyond the Built Environment, and a nonprofit organization that's focused on many things, including the increased representation in build design fields. Our moderator this evening is Trevor Bol, who has been working with me for some time on developing the panel. He is the Dean of the School of Design at Dunwoody College of Technology. Trevor is a broadly experienced architect with over 25 years of professional experience. He has significant international experience, having worked on a wide range of projects of architecture, landscape architecture, and planning in Europe, the Caribbean, and the United States. Most recently, Trevor was Senior Associate and Director of Operations at Snow Krylik Architects here in Minneapolis, which was the recipient of the 2018 AIA Architecture Firm Award. From 2000 to 2016, he led an award-winning architecture and planning studio on the island of Grenada, completing more than 30 built projects. The work of his firm has been published extensively in journals and books, as well as being exhibited at the 2021 Architecture Biennale in Venice. In addition to practice, Trevor has remained active, to say the least, in academia. It is where he's immersed now, of course, at Dunwoody. He's taught architectural design at the Boston Architectural College, the City College of New York, as well as the University of Minnesota, and is a frequent guest critic at schools of architecture nationwide. We are truly grateful to have all of you here. Before I hand it over to Trevor to announce our panelists and introduce them, I'd like to remind everyone that the questions for this webinar will be submitted through the Q&A function and not the chat. We will not be checking the chat for questions. So again, Trevor and panelists, thank you so much. And Trevor, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jean. It is just such a pleasure to be here tonight. I'd like to thank you, Jean, for all the work that you've put in getting us to this point. I'd like to thank the Goldstein Museum of Design for this opportunity to talk about these sort of really pressing and important issues. And of course, the Say It Loud exhibition for highlighting the work of underrepresented people in our profession. I'd like to first introduce Jody Mcguire, who's a principal at SALA Architects in Minneapolis and an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Minnesota College of Design. Her work experience includes residential and institutional work in Connecticut, New York, and Japan. In 2017, she received the AIA Minnesota Emerging Talent Award for demonstrated excellence in residential design for the boldness in developing her own architectural voice. She is also an AIA Minnesota Young Architect Award recipient, given for exceptional leadership and significant contributions to the profession. Also joining us tonight is Jennifer Newsom, a licensed architect, artist, and principal of Dream the Combine that she co-founded with Tom Carruthers in 2013. Through her practice, Jennifer has co-produced numerous site-specific installations in the US and Canada that explore metaphors, perceptual uncertainties, and the boundary between real and illusionary space. Dream the Combine are the winner of the 2018 Young Architects program at MoMA PS1 in New York for their installation called Hide and Seek, and the 2020-21 J. Irwin and Zinnia S. Miller Prize recipients. And last but not least, we have Anna Pravinata, AIA NOMA. Anna is a principal at Alliance, a firm here locally in Minneapolis. She has dedicated much of her professional career to designing leading-edge research facilities for both corporate and academic institutions. Anna utilizes her strength in comprehensive planning, client communication, and design team management to translate clients' needs into exceptional research environments. As a 2021 AIA Minnesota president, Anna advocates for inclusive culture in the architectural profession. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. So we asked our panelists if they could start out and just give us a sort of a teaser, because today I'd really like to focus very much on personal stories, because I think very often when we speak about issues of diversity or we speak about underrepresentation, they are often in very broad general terms. And I think that it's really important that we touch on the specific experience of people to really enlighten us as we think about these issues. So I'd like to ask Jody if she wouldn't mind jumping in.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this exciting event. And I'm just going to get my screen share. All right. You hopefully are now all seeing a splash page, and if not, someone will yell at me. So as Trevor said, I think something to think about is just great for our community is knowing more of our stories and to be able to connect and identify across. So here's a quick run through of some stories here. I grew up in places with no architecture, arguably. This is the Superior National Forest near Ely. This is the Monte La Salle National Forest near Price and Moab, Utah, and the Dakota Prairie grassland. So beautiful, beautiful spaces with very few people. And certainly I didn't know any architects along that way, but quickly found myself interested in art, interested in math, and the generalist ideas that could be found across architecture, and found myself at the University of Minnesota. This slide would probably be familiar to a lot of you. This was the time where I was an undergrad at the U. You were in the College of Liberal Arts. I was very proudly in the CLA programs across the university. Through there, I spent time studying abroad in Denmark. That quickly came back and went straight to graduate school. This is the Yale School of Architecture, the pit and the now paprika carpet that you'll see there. So surveys in the round from Yale kind of launched one of my first professional experiences, the biggest firm I've ever worked with. I found myself in Osaka, Japan, working on a floor of 400 people in a section, the design department of Takanaka Corporation. On my floor were 400 people and 3 women. Myself, a woman who had done a structural engineering degree from Alaska, and office lady, they called her. So a vastly interesting start to a professional workplace situation. But after school, I landed at Gray-Urgansky Architecture, and that was in New Haven, a very, very lucky landing for me. This was the door to the office, but right next door was the first project I got to work on in 3 years. And the relationship, this slide is just the Google Street View, but you can see the office and the building site, the studio desk, and the actual place of building side by side. So that was a very fortunate event and a fun creative project, but also Lisa Gray it's a husband and wife partnership. Lisa Gray and Alan Organsky was just really great to me in letting me in, not just into the design of a building, but how she ran her practice. Though we were about 8 people at that time, and it was a huge learning curve for me, and an enlightening experience just to see like what Lisa had to do through her daily life to let me see how a small studio could function with her leadership there. After that, for 7 years, I practiced with Aaron Amison in New Haven, Connecticut. We had a small project, small practice together. One of us often had sort of a day job while we were doing this, but in small institutional work, small residential work, a lot of time in and out of New York City for residential interior projects. So there's us, here's a smattering of work. And from this period, it was really committed clients who were interested in doing something new and in supporting some pretty young architects. Made this a really good time for us. Then you're seeing some small projects we did. And then after about 7 years, we were either going to need to dig in and commit to New Haven and open up our own firm there, but we really did have a kind of a calling back to the Midwest to make Minneapolis our home city and to work with more and different people. Again, so I joined SALA Architects, and here you can see some images of the cultural landscape of who we are, and then the bottom row, the leadership landscape of my being the youngest and the only female partner in the mix there. So this is typically what SALA has looked like over the last few years, but over the last 2 years, we've looked a lot more like this. And you can see I'm the one taking the selfie with one of the two twins in my arms. An interesting time. So in 2019, we wrote the first paid family leave policy for the office. So I greatly benefited through that. And I think there's lots to say, and then COVID hit and so much more to say about caregiving, infrastructure, and architecture around. Maybe we'll get back to that as a panel conversation. Here's some SALA work, a house on the North Shore, a house here in Minneapolis. But the greatest thing about the residential work is the one-on-one. You get to know your clients and their place so well. So that's where I am now professionally, and also teaching studios at the University of Minnesota. So kind of returning to a similar point of view, looking down at that courtyard. And this is where thinking, of that old photo to this photo, there's about a 20-year gap, and saying, who was in that photo? Where are the graduates going that aren't quite practicing architecture maybe as typically or as normatively as I might be, and how do we kind of think about where all the students, former students are, and former students might go, and how that's all inclusive in who we are and what we do. So that's my kickoff intro.
Thanks, Jody. I really appreciate it. Jennifer, maybe you could jump off from here.
All right. That was great, Jody. I love seeing the orange carpet that is familiar to both of us. I am gonna share slides. Okay. Hey everyone. I wish I could see all of you, but I see names in the participant list, so many familiar faces. Hello. I feel like the title of this event, every time I say it, I should be shouting, but I'm shouting quietly. But thank you so much for having me as part of this panel discussion. So inviting me here to speak this evening. So I'll talk a little bit about my journey. And in the process, I'll talk about my practice during the Combine. The name is a little odd, but our partnership negotiates many binaries: Black, white, male, female, foreigner, citizen. We don't know what it's like to be in each other's skin. And much of our work is about bridging this gap in understanding, exploring the collision of multiple identities and contexts through installations in public space. Now, Tom, we're here, he'd get to present more of his side of the story, but I'm just going to talk about mine. And we were asked to talk about our sort of personal experiences as a way of kind of grounding the way we think and approach the discipline. I've known I wanted to be an architect ever since I was 8 years old, drawing houses on my father's legal pads in a self-made fortress underneath our dining room table. It was all I ever wanted to do. And so this very abstract idea, I sort of continually followed it. So, my first experiences as an undergrad at Yale were with architecture professor Jody Mcguire. We had to make a project, it was called the box problem, where all the cuts were made from an edge, and the project incorporated a vertical, diagonal, and horizontal elements, so a chimney, a stair, and a bridge. And from this very kind of abstract way of thinking about form making and space, I was really hooked and excited by, sharing is paused. I don't know what just happened. Can folks still, I just stopped my share because something just happened.
Something just came up.
Oh,
See, you want to try that again?
Yeah, I think hold on a second. My keynote went away. Oh. Sorry about that. Let me start over here. Can folks see this again?
We can see it, yep.
Okay, I'm gonna just click quickly through here. And then from Yale, I kind of went to what was then sort of Yale Part 2, was working at Robert A.M. Stern's office with a number of my former TAs who were in the office at the time. So Jody and Aaron Goyle and Warren Vivat and Tom Warbitzer and Mark Gage, that actually made my time there, even if I was just like a kind of lowly person in the model shop, really enriching and fun. Then I went back to Yale for graduate school. So lots of time in this orange carpet. And the picture on the upper right is showing a project for a studio with Jack Robertson, which was to design a residential college for Yale's campus. And after that, I ended up working at Cooper Robertson, which is the lower left image, designing kind of an island resort, private homes, like these spaces that I probably would never, ever get to inhabit myself. And then also worked at Adjaye Associates and Deborah Burke Partners in terms of my professional experience. And in all of these places, they each had their own culture and ways of kind of maneuvering through them, but really were opportunities where I felt like my ideas were valued and as though I really belonged there. But there were also many points where I didn't feel that the profession wanted me. So I think that even at the same time that there were these kind of like formative successes and really like kind of incredible experiences that I had, there was still this sort of subtle and veiled tug of anti-Blackness and gendered stereotypes that I faced while moving through school, the profession, and academia. I think early on, maybe my constant desire to please and achieve some standard of quote unquote excellence perhaps didn't leave a lot of room to reconsider how that standard was defined and who did the defining. There is a sense of self-alienation as I didn't see a diversity of people celebrated and elevated for their accomplishments. I didn't always have language for how I felt about this at the time. And much of my journey then and since has been about the vulnerability of parsing the words, of finding these kind of material languages to speak. So when I was a second-year graduate student at Yale, I planned a symposium, a 2-day symposium called Black Boxes about race and architecture, in part because I was struggling with a statement a professor made early on in my studies. On literally the first day of class, he told us there's no such thing as Black architecture. I was immediately reminded of Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, namely that we Black people exist within the world, but also within others' perceptions of us in the world. So surviving means a kind of constant negotiation of these two zones, and the inherent doubling creates a feeling of two-ness. I'm Black, and I was sitting in the room. I wanted to be an architect. So how could the fact of my existence and his statement be reconciled? So I had many experiences where I felt at home, I felt encouraged, and I felt that the world was welcoming me on my path to becoming an architect. But it was equally powerful to discover where I felt unwanted and undervalued. And these experiences, whether overt or subtle, felt like a kind of sliding on quicksand, always double thinking my next move. The ground is not the ground. There are 2 or 3 or 4 grounds overlaid on top of each other. Corners rise up, stiff walls, a game board that is shifting as you are playing it. Sometimes I feel like I'm not that adept at thinking around corners or seeing through walls. I feel outsmarted by it. And my intellectual life is something I have to cultivate against interests and inner voices that would tell me that I don't belong. So my work then too is about this seeing around, seeing through, or seeing otherwise in a world that prefigures much of what we think we know. So from the moment my professor said those words, there's no such thing as Black architecture, I became increasingly intrigued by the ways the surface and the visual perception of it could be contrasted with their converses of depth, mass, and tangibility. If race is a social construct, perhaps it's a provocative and productive place that could reconsider architecture's foundations of surface and support, figure and ground, perception versus reality. These are kind of basic processes that structure how we choose to relate to one another in the world. What are the preconditions for love that we can establish? How can we in our work aim to constantly question and reimagine the inheritances we carry and work toward a present where everyone feels they belong? If memory is encoding, storage, and retrieval, what are our foundational frameworks that we continually rehash? The work of Dream the Combine might be described as opening up arenas for other futures. So my earlier professor thought I had no history, that somehow my history had nothing to contribute to architecture as a discipline, that there was something universal that somehow transcended culture, even as architecture is a product of culture. Gulsum Bedar writes that, quote, all cultural systems are constructed in an ambivalent space of enunciation and a discontinuous time of translation and negotiation, end quote. As such, then all architectural discourse is to fill up that empty space of signification that is architecture by strategic inclusions and exclusions. And so in my professional life, I think one of the questions Trevor had for us was talking about pinch points in our career. And I realize now, like once I had kids is when I stopped like working for other people and sort of pivoted to becoming an academic and having my own practice. But throughout, I've kind of tried to open up space, for others to step through. And really, our work is about bringing people together. We aim to kind of problematize those strategic exclusions, these blind spots that are evident in our cultural landscape. Much of our work is about challenging our perceptions, engaging our procedural deep time memories, and reordering space to encourage new ways of engaging with context and with each other. People are the activating agents in our work, and much of it is about this kind of, creating a setting for something to happen. We think about space making as a provocation to performance. And performance, I use that in a very sometimes active, sometimes very passive way, like the fact of just being and feeling like you can be in place, in a place. We've worked in transportation corridors. This is the project in St. Paul for Northern Spark. On city streets, in abandoned infrastructure, often seeking spaces on the margins. We use these kind of languages and tools that we have as architects. Much of our work has this sort of lightness of drawing and a kind of expressiveness of structure. Again, really trying to make evident the way something is made, the kind of underpinnings of it. We are also interested in telling news stories, inserting counter narratives into our dominant flow. So this was a recent project that we just completed in August, it just opened as part of the Miller Prize, where there are 58 of these flagpole-like props without their flags, without their images. But instead they have this kind of text that wraps the shaft of each one of the poles that is specific to a particular place that has been named after Christopher Columbus. So moving through it is actually sort of negotiating this landscape as kind of resultant from colonialism and a kind of imperialist exploration practices. So these kind of stories you start to piece together this sort of counter narrative, these other kinds of stories about these places as you move through the installation. And I'll leave with maybe some literally incendiary images, but these were photographs that Tom and I took about a year ago. And I think it really points to the fact that the world is getting constantly made and remade. And we need to decide what kind of world we want to live within. I think that that's part of the conversation here tonight. you know, in Minneapolis at that time, there were these kind of informal infrastructures of care that sort of sprang up all over the city during the protests. And I wrote an article about this for Mass Context about what it means to be a witness when all of this is unfolding. And one of the images in that article was this one. And I wrote, often roving medics would walk through the crowds. I remember them as though they were dressed in army fatigues, but of course the photo tells otherwise. The tent wasn't something official from the Red Cross, but it was actually just some red duct tape plastered to a simple tent. They were just ordinary people. People stepped up in the ways they felt they could with the skill sets that they had. On there.
Thanks, Jennifer. Really appreciate that. What a great way to kick this off. There's so much to unpack there. Now we'll hear from Anna.
All right, so thank you for the opportunity to be part of this fantastic panel. I just hope that my technology works. So let's see. Do you see my screen?
I see your screen, Anna. Yep.
Okay, and then do you see me flipping the screen?
Yep, everything's working.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so thank you again. So similar to all of you, I have multiple identities besides being an architect. A mother, a wife, a woman, person of color, Chinese Indonesian, an immigrant, and an introvert. These identities shape my experience in my journey. So when I was in graduate school and needed more guidance in my studio class, I was told flat out that I will never be an architect. And this white male studio instructor was very unaccommodating to my need for extra help. And then when I came back from my first maternity leave, I found out that I was paid significantly less than my male peers. And when I asked, the answer was, well, you are a working mom now. We don't know how you are going to perform. And, you know, there's another experience. After 5+ years with a particular firm, I wasn't getting promoted while people around me with less experience and less responsibilities were getting promoted. So of course I asked, right? And then the answer was like, well, you are quiet and we don't know that you are interested in moving up. And you know, there are microaggressions along the way, such as, hey, is your boss not coming to the meeting today? And this is when referring to my white male colleague, not boss. You know, so I took a deep breath and I tell myself, okay, you age well and you look 10 years younger than you actually are. You know, so then I just let it go, you know, to being like flat out interrupted, ignored, and dismissed in various meetings. So how do these experiences kind of like shape my journey, right? And shape how I approach design is I tend to want to listen first before I even put the first line on the paper. I tend to want to understand how they need to work in the space and not having preconceived notions on the shapes of the building. I tend to ask them the design criteria to analyze the design options objectively instead of using my subjective criteria. And oftentimes, my way of working is perceived as I am a weak designer who doesn't have strong design concepts from the get-go, instead of a designer who loves to work collaboratively and truly passionate about making the client's dream a reality. With all of these biases against me, I knew all along that I need a title. I need a positional power to be heard, to affect change, and to increase representation of people with similar identities as mine on the leadership table. So, you know, I gave myself a random goal that I want to be a principal before I turn 40 and then start changing the culture, right? So fast forward a few years later with principal title at Alliance, and this year I'm president of AIA Minnesota. I can say that I am an architect with certainty instead of full of self-doubt. So what I do with my positional power. So this is my team at Alliance. These are my team members. I advocate fiercely for them. for interesting projects for them to work on, for a space on the table for them, for a safe space where they can share their ideas. I rely on them heavily, and their makeup, is 60% women, 33% person of color, 66% working parents, and 33% immigrants. And at AIA Minnesota, if you haven't heard, we have an initiative called Culture Change Initiative. Through years of research and conversations, we define that the core elements of the culture we want are authentic, equitable, and collaborative. We use systems thinking from Donnelly Meadows. The items farther from the fulcrum will have significant impact with small interventions. We decided to start that changing the mindset would be, smallest interventions with biggest impact, right? So examples of a pair of mindsets is here. The one on the left hinders desired culture. Individual achievement is primary, the hero architect. Pursuit of legacy is noble and individualistic in nature. And then the mindset that accelerates desired culture is collaboration is primary. Credit and legacy are a team-based, and that team includes all aspects of projects. So we also created a community of practice for this culture change, where there is a safe space to talk about moving towards the desired culture. It is open to all. We share learnings, we develop and experiment with interventions. The most important thing, we keep constant attention on this work. So the graphic here showed how we come with possible actions for a pair of mindsets, the mindset that, kind of like the hero architect versus the collaborative nature of architecture. And, we come up with possible actions for that pair of mindsets and then map them based on the system theory. So we say, if we redefine the goals of the design awards processes, we'll get more results than as, let's say number 10, which is assign multiple project managers. So those kind of things, we work through those kind of things in that community of practice. So please join. This is one way to start increasing representation of women and BIPOC in our profession. And in conclusion, my personal struggles and successes have brought me here today in front of you. There's still a lot of work to do for the profession to be truly diverse from all layers, from students to early career staff to leadership. If you are a woman, if you are a BIPOC, please step up. Don't be afraid to be visible. Claim your seat on the table, take charge, and start affecting change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, Jennifer, and Jody. That was really just really sort of inspiring to get a glimpse of how you got to where you are. And so I think that, in thinking about this panel and the Say It Loud exhibition, right? The main purpose of the exhibition is, as Pascale has sort of set it up, right, is to sort of highlight the work of underrepresented professionals within the built environment. And this is done with the goal of increasing representation and, by extension, sort of diversity of our profession. And my hope with this discussion tonight is that we can sort of unpack the significance of this, of what this brings and what opportunities we have in opening up the profession to more voices. And I want to do that, as I mentioned at the top, by really sort of delving in to your personal stories in a real tangible way. And I think what I'd like to start with is what I think Jennifer queued up a little bit, which is this idea of pinch points that was identified in the 2018 Equity and Design Survey that really show that that there are a series of pinch points within the profession, whether it's sort of licensure or starting a family, that really begin to impact the choices and the trajectory that that architects face. And for me, it was this desire to be my own boss and start my own firm. And for that, I felt like I needed to leave the country. I just felt like the obstacles seemed just not insurmountable, but they seemed onerous. And I felt that returning to my native Caribbean was the way that it would allow me to progress. And frankly, I was right. I think I think that was the right choice for me. So I'm really curious if to hear from you what that was like, and what are some of those pinch points for you? And Jennifer, since you teed that up in your introduction, I'm going to go to you first on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think, all of our lives have different seasons, right? Or different phases that we move through. And, there's nothing radical about wanting to start a family or get married or move house or, change a job. But there's something sort of, at least at the time that I had kids, which was not that long ago. My son is 11. That seems somewhat, static and sort of unyielding within the profession in the face of that, right? People are having children and doing these kind of life changes for, since time immemorial. But what is it about architecture's sort of resistance to accommodating that? And that I think that's something that's a real issue that is increasingly becoming more to the forefront. I think it also is very culturally specific to region too. I mean, I think at that time I was in New York and I didn't have very many friends who had kids. You didn't want to tell your boss that you had a family. It was just no. Anna, to your point of someone saying, oh, well, you're a mom now. You're not going to contribute and work as that was definitely the sort of mindset in which, the water in which I was swimming. So, and I think, those big life changes, they cause you to kind of rethink your own life trajectory, independent of just thinking about your profession, right? So for me, it was really a crystallizing moment of well, what do I really want to do? Because something that's going to take me away from this little person who is so wonderful has got to be worth it. It's got to be working for me. So at that point, I just took a little bit of a pause and I spent more time with him. And, was fortunate enough to be able to do that. And a lot of people aren't, but, it was just an opportunity for me to think kind of more concretely about what I wanted to get out of being a part of this discipline. So then I kind of structured my life in a way where I could have the stability of the academic job, but then allow the practice to be more experimental. So that was the structure that I landed on, whether we'll see if it continues to work. But so far, so good.
Yeah, and I think that that's clearly just not an uncommon story, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anna?
So I have very different career paths, right, than Jennifer and Jody. I graduated, I've worked in to larger firms, and for the lack of better word, climbed the corporate ladder, right? And I felt like the pinch point for me was that first step of promotion. It's kind of how I got there. I finally realized at that point that I cannot just work hard, make my clients happy. I have to have a strategy for my career. How do I move up? How do I develop, myself personally? And, who are the people to talk to kind of advocate for me? So then I suddenly realized that, nurturing my career is the thing I need to do in addition to, working projects well and make clients happy, right? So when I started thinking about that, things started to open up for me. Opportunities started to open up, because I wasn't raised here, so I wasn't familiar with how corporate America works. but, after that first pinch point, I felt like, okay, so this is how it's going to work. I understand that, certain clients will look at me and dismiss me. So I try to avoid those type of clients. And I just like dwell within kind of like the project types or the client types that can accept me the way I am, and I feel like Jennifer said, I have 2 kids at home. I want my job to be worth it, to be like away from them and to be fulfilling. So I tend to like, choose my clients or people I interact with wisely, so, and, it's not all people can do that. And I feel like I'm the lucky one who can like do that, so yeah, so that's kind of like my story about pinch point and, putting strategy to my career in addition to like working hard on projects.
And the strategy then, is that focused really mostly on the project type and client types, or is there a sort of larger strategy at play when you're thinking about this?
So it's more like personal development, right? Like leadership development, starting to ask the firm to sponsor me, to get more training or do volunteer work, be part of the community and, like be part of AIA Minnesota, things like that kind, so then by being around people, and not being raised here, I start to understand how I can speak about myself without sounding snobbish, because that's not me. I don't toot my own horn, but it's kind of like, the way you talk about your projects, the way you talk about yourself, the way you talk about your teams, it's kind of like all this communication style that I needed to start learning, right, in order to be successful in here in the United States. So.
Thanks. Jody, did you have a similar experience?
I think in personal pinch points, I was lucky that when I had my kids, I'm a partner in the office and kind of have a lot of breadth to shape what I need and supportive people around me. But But I also think our whole country, our whole world is at some weird pinch point right now. I think coming out of this pandemic, has exposed how fragile all these systems are, and there may be, hope and some readjustments to come. But personally, I got licensed really young. I just was young and I was a decent test taker, check that box. But I think, you step back and that is a real pinch point that we should have a lot more control over. That's like a pinch point that, the brains in the room, we should be able to massage that one, the whole worldwide ability of caregiving and duty, that's a harder one, but I think more people are looking at that issue across the board now. So I don't know, it seems like there's hope that I think we can attack that licensure and figure out how it doesn't have to be a pinch point forever. I'm optimistic with energy for that, and not that you want everyone to be pinched, but if they are,
you don't want it to be that.
Attention.
Yeah, but I mean, I think you bring up a good point, which is that if the pinch point of licensure is something that we as a profession have a really direct control over.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we, I know that NCARB and others have really been making an effort in that area, and I think that we'll see those some of those barriers come down. But I still think it's still pretty significant, the cost and the time and some of the other factors that go into it.
Yeah,
and I think also people's attitudes about licensure are very different. Like there's a lot of project types that you can engage with that you don't have to have a license. I mean, I am licensed, but have I actually ever stamped anything for what I'm doing? Not really, but that's just the nature of our practice.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it goes to something, Anna, that you said about sort of standing up and being counted. So I always advise students, especially if they're women or people of color, to get your license, because once you have that, it's like a, it's a piece of paper that somebody can't take away from you. It's like a gate that you've stepped through. And in my case, it actually was what allowed me to work in another country. I mean, when I moved to Canada, I was able to get a NAFTA visa and be able to work there because I was a quote unquote professional. So there are ways in which it might come into play that you can't even anticipate. But I think, in the way you framed it as on a stepping into a position of power to be heard, I think licensure is in some ways one of those kind of, switch points on that path.
Yeah, and I think that that's really one of the very clear biases that we have culturally within the profession, right? I at one of the meetings, actually this one at one of the AIA Equity and Diversity and Inclusion meetings that was held at Alliance, I think, sorry, at Alliance. One of the folks on the committee pointed out this this bias against folks who were unlicensed, and sort of said, this is one of the issues that we should be addressing. And this was an architect who's very successful, I would say, or I should probably more correctly call them a designer, but they was significantly more successful than pretty much everybody in the room, right? In terms of the number of projects they had produced. But they told me, that there are times when that they'd actually been called a fraud by people who are licensed architects, right? And I think that we really need to start thinking about what that means, right? Because I think one of the problems that we have within our profession is that there are many ways in which to be and to work within the built environment. And we continue to sell ourselves, and we sell it to students in a very, very narrow way. And I'd love to hear if you had any thoughts on how we might be able to begin to open that up.
I think maybe, so right now, climate crisis is an issue, right? And that's one area that we as architects and designers can help solve, right? So, and the work doesn't necessarily need a licensure, right? So that's kind of like broadening, how we look at architects or designers, right? The other work is the type of work like community engagement, right? In kind of like city projects or big government projects, or whatever, community projects. You need a team who can engage effectively with the community, and that team may not necessarily be the architecture team, because oftentimes architects don't know how to do community engagement well, but there are, a group of architects who do know, and I don't think to do that kind of work, they need licensure, right? And then the other thing is kind of like, like advocacy, there are like so much other stuff instead of just like stamping, stamping your name on a drawing, right? And in my 23 years of career, even though I'm licensed, I never signed a drawing. Okay, so, and I don't know why I need to be licensed, because I don't sign drawings, but so that's kind of like the thing. I think look at the work that architects and designers can be like effective to change, like the climate action, the community engagement, those type of work. No need for licensure, but they will benefit from like a design thinking process, right? So that's what I say.
Well, I think I'm just echoing what you said, but there's sort of a stretch, right, of what our profession can encompass as the work. If the point of kind of this panel is to elevate different voices, different people, different who within the world of architecture. I think the different what also, is also starting to stretch and could be stretched further and further, so people could identify and see a place for that work. And some of that has to do with even media and what gets promoted out into the world, that work.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I feel like it's sort of a double-headed process, right? There's the there are plenty of, there's lots of different ways to be an architect and to contribute, many of which truly do not require a license, like, at all. That said, change is slow. So I feel like there's both the need for the kind of like radical rethinking of how we, structure our criteria. What is our language around, like who actually gets to use the word architect? How we can make the process less onerous, like move the timeline up. Like, should people be licensed, like, as soon as they graduate from school? That's a question. Other professions do that. I think there's kind of, larger structural changes that we can address, but then there's also the kind of culture, right? Like sort of what Jody and Anna are saying of like widening the lens of what we think architecture is for and what architects can do. So I think you have to kind of work both at the same time. And that is part of what helps shift the sort of culture around what we value within the profession. So right now, it's still holding on to the way it has been. So I still think it's I don't know. I mean, I have friends who, have really wonderful, like kind of critically engaged practices. And they're like, oh yeah, I'm studying for my exams. I'm like, really? I thought that you already licensed. And they're like, no, but I've got to get it because it is this barrier. It's this thing that like keeps coming up. So, we're not certainly not there yet in terms of thinking about it not having the same sort of like, resonance or cachet, but I think we can be kind of chipping away at it in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. I'm of two minds about it, right? Because like on the one hand, I get really pissed off when, like every other profession slips the word architect in there, right? You're like some sort of IT architect, and it's like, what, you're not, But then on the other hand, I just think, well, what does it really mean? And I think that when I was thinking about this is that if I just informally think of the people that I know who have been working in this field for a long time, but aren't licensed, they are disproportionately people of color and women, hands down. Like I just sort of did the mental map with the people I went to school with and just the people I know, and that is just an unescapable fact, and I think there's a correlation there, and I think that there's and I just, as you said, Anna, you've been doing this for a while. So what is it that this licensure is, what is it getting us? And I think that's what I'm really intrigued to think about, like, what is it that we really value? Do we value your actual skill set, or do we value, your ability to take the exam?
Yeah, I think, because as architects, as licensed architects, you are held to a higher standard, right? You have to maintain, you have to take those HSW credits, right? So I feel like, like in our office, we call the non-licensed architects design professionals. So they do design, they're a professional, but they're not licensed architects. And, I feel like as a profession, we have to look at the design professionals in a similar way with architects. not like you're like a second grade citizen because you are design professionals, not architects, because these design professionals may have better critical thinking than some licensed architects. They may have better design sense than some licensed architects, or community engagement or sustainability, those kind of things. So I think in my mind, as a profession, we have to kind of like change our mindset, right? Like what I said with the AIA Culture Change Initiative, that design professionals can contribute the same way with the architects. It's just that, signing the building, signing the drawings, HSW, that's more like in the architect's court, right? But in terms of critical design thinking, engaging with communities, solving climate problems, we're like equal, so I think it's like changing that mindset, so.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one to begin to think about. And like I said, just by seeing that correlation, it really made me start to wonder whether, for instance, whether like they do in France, you become licensed upon graduation, right? And this is certainly something that we're working on at Dunwoody in terms of trying to shorten the distance between schooling and licensure. But it does make me wonder whether, whether we're actually producing or whether we're gaining better outcomes by structuring that path the way it's currently structured. So I'm just shifting focus just a little bit. I wanted to talk about the sort of the sort of central premise of increased representation, right? Which is this idea that by having greater representation, we provide a sort of an example, a living example for other people to potentially follow, right? Within and have an example for other people to see themselves in. Did you, as you were coming up, I think that I made a note of this. I think Anna said you said a sort of a nurturing. Did you have a person, an advocate, or somebody that you saw yourself in as you were sort of embarking on this journey?
So I think when I first started my career, I was working in teams that were led by 3 young mothers, okay? And that kind of like gave me a picture in my head. Okay, I can have both. I can be a mom and I can be an architect. That's doable. Okay, and then also when I start to look for a firm to be kind of like my forever home, I ask questions like, what is your leadership makeup? Is there women in your leadership? Just to kind of like give me that mental picture that if I want it, it's possible, And then also in AIA Minnesota, Karen Liu, the past president, showed it possible that, a woman of color can be AIA Minnesota president. So, so that's why I'm kind of like, okay, I'll try. I'll put my name in the hat, So those are kind of like the things that people who kind of like gave me examples and mental picture of what, what is possible.
Jody or Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know any architects growing up. Like Jody, I was like, oh, I like art and I like math. That seems like a joining of the two. And then, but there were people that, I researched just kind of like, oh, well, I'm just curious, like, are there any people who look like me who do this? And so I was, this was like when I was starting in college. So Allison Williams was one, who I met probably 15 to 20 years later, and I was like total fangirling about her, like, oh, you don't know this, but like when I was just starting out in architecture, I would read about you and the work you were doing. And I have a very different path and different kind of practice than her. But it was helpful to see that it was kind of possible just to see yourself reflected in some way. And then I think I would always like seek out different kind of mentoring relationships. So, even when I would like travel to go visit family, I was like, okay, so I'm going to Miami, like who teaches like at XYZ school that I could try and meet with, and just follow people's work that I was interested in. I would say Yolanda Daniels was like another person that I would sort of like watch from afar. When we went to Rome for our drawing studio, she was a fellow at the American Academy, and we like walked into her studio and I was just like, this is amazing. But now, there are two women in particular who I really count as core mentors, Deborah Burke and Billy Chin, who, I feel like I've talked to them at many pivotal points in my career, and I know that I can always lean on them, but you have to seek those people out. And, in many environments where I was situated, like I always had to search outside. So the onus always was kind of on me to find those people. But I think you need them. I mean, mentorship is so important. It's so incredibly important. And, I think a lot of young people, they don't necessarily, some are more, outgoing and willing to kind of make those connections, but many are very quiet and they don't really seek those relationships out. And I think we need to have more structure around that process so that we capture more people. That it's not always on the kind of loud, outgoing, outspoken person to go and find someone to foster that relationship, but that there could be kind of a more formal process by which that happens.
Did you look to anyone, Jody?
I feel like I had happy accidents along the way, mostly starting in grad school. Like when I was, interested in teaching studio, I became a TA for the building project, but then the studio coordinator was like, oh, you're a good critical thinker, but you don't really know how to put this together yet. And so she would let me, kind of like see how she was molding the semester from a kind of a studio design standpoint. And we're still in touch today. So things like that were just like little glimpses, it was Louise Hartman at that point in time. She wasn't giving me a lot, but she was giving me enough that I didn't have. And, she's still, check in every few years now, but she was the coordinator of that studio semester. And so that was really great. And I don't think it took a lot of time from her, but just being open and having me around in a situation like that. And the same thing at Garagansky. Lisa and I were the only women in the office too, as the kind of like the bookends, the principal and the month out of school. But that let us kind of connect, and maybe her share extra with me than she did with other people perhaps. And so I greatly benefited from that. And I try to pass that on too, and just be sort of an open book. And it's not a complete mentorship, but when you can let someone into what you're doing or decisions you're making, hopefully it has lasting effects.
No, definitely. It's one of the things. It's interesting when I think about that question. Jennifer, you mentioned this sort of self-alienation. So for me, I was lucky enough to go to college where the dean of my school was Max Bond Jr., right? One of the most prominent African American architects of the 20th century, but ironically, because of that sort of self-isolation, I didn't really see, he was very kind to me and very good to me. But I did not see him in quite those terms, mostly because he was not the kind of person who was being featured in the magazines and being held up all of the time. And I think that was one of those, that sort of doubling the Jennifer mentioned, right? Where, yeah, you see yourself in them on the one hand, but then you self-isolate because that doesn't seem to be what's being valued, right? And so it's a very weird sort of headspace to be in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious, like, I wonder, do you think that's changing? Or are we continuing to elevate the same?
You know, I fear that we're elevating a lot of the same. You know, I can even tell you that, you know, when I was at City College is when Jack Travis had his book out, right? African American.
Jack is another one of my mentors.
Yeah. And so, but you know, he came out, he was, you know, he's based in New York, so he was around City College, and I picked up the book and I was like, yeah, I love the cool book, you know, but again, it was like none of the folks who were highlighted were the folks who were being elevated. And it was a very big disconnect for me.
Yeah.
And I hope that's changing.
I think that what's happening now is recognizing the limitations of architectural press, the award system, that it is a kind of like self-reinforcing loop to a certain extent. And I say this like recognizing that I'm also like part of that to a certain extent. Like I have, you know, definitely benefited from that, but I think I think whereas previously the conversation was about like, okay, how do we inject a different kind of energy into that cycle? Now it's like, no, we're just starting our own institutions. We're just like starting different things, right? Like, you know, different journalistic platforms, different kinds of structures for academic institutions, rethinking pedagogy in different ways. Like, you know, Tom and I were listening to a panel discussion with Stacey Jones, and he was saying, he's like, yeah, juxtaposition arts is amazing, but we need 100 juxtas, right? We really have to think about institution building in a much different way, because otherwise we're always going to be like knocking on the door of these like gatekeeping kind of systems. So I think that's kind of the benefit of this moment, right? Is like feeling like, okay, that whole apple cart got kind of like overturned, right? With our twin pandemics, right? That are sort of in the forefront of everyone's mind. And I would say, you know, really there's three, right? Climate, racial justice, and COVID. But hopefully coming out of that, there's a way in which people are willing to kind of embrace radical change in like a complete stepping aside. I mean, I think one of your questions you sent to us ahead of time was talking about if we see that there's a kind of fatigue setting in, or I don't know, kind of backsliding, or like, and I think that's definitely, I think that is definitely the case, right? So I don't know, I still remain optimistic that there are seeds of things that are continuing to grow and will continue to branch out and really change the way things are done. But I do see that there is this kind of like recalibration of the sense of urgency. And I think it's still as urgent as it ever was. Like, you know, with the exception of COVID, these things are not new. You know, like there's novel coronavirus, but like racial injustice and climate issues are not new. We've known about these for a long time. So I think that is always the challenge, is like, how do we move through these sort of like moments of urgency and flashpoints without losing the thread, that like there's still enough momentum to take us from, you know, one to the next, to the next, to the next, so they're actually building on something.
I think those just echo into the need for inclusion. Like there's so much work to be done to be included or expansive. It's just kind of like echoes that need and call and hope, I guess.
I do think that the fact that the way in which, the way in which we're able to see work, right? Whereas, certainly when I was in school, there were a handful of magazines, and they were sort of they sort of told you what was good and who was celebrated. I mean, I think we do still see a lot of the same people being sort of cycled through, right? But there are certainly more forums that I think are able to sort of open you up to work that's maybe happening in other places. And I think that's certainly something to be optimistic about. So let's talk about that issue of fatigue that Jennifer raised.
You brought it up first.
Yeah, I brought it up first, but you teed it up for me, right? Which is that, I appreciate that all of you sort of work in this space, and I sense the fatigue not only in others, but at times in myself, right? Because I'm often asked my opinion on some of these issues, and sometimes I feel like I'm no expert, really, and so it can be taxing. But how do we sort of keep the momentum of the moment? Because I think that this is a very sort of pivotal moment in the in the way in which we think about our profession, and I think that there's so much good that can and hopefully will come out of this, but how do we sort of combat some of that fatigue that we're seeing?
Curious a little bit about Anna. I feel like it is an organizational opportunity or need, or it's structural beyond the individual. So passing it to Anna.
I think, so equity, diversity, inclusion, DEI or JEDI, or, that needs to be integrated in a firm culture or organization culture. Again, it cannot be like a separate task force or separate initiative, okay? Because if you have it separately, then you can get fatigued, you can get tired of, oh geez, another initiative, right? So I think it needs to really be integral to a firm culture or to an organization culture, right? So I think, ideally, when you look at, for example, like promotion for staff, you look at everybody, right? You look at the skills, you look at their contribution, but you don't look at, oh, I had beer with this guy every week, I like him, then let's promote him, So I think, be able to kind of like clearly say the criteria, like for example, for promotion, and then analyze all the staff based on the criteria, right? So that's kind of like, you don't separate that as kind of like an EDI initiative. That's firm culture, how you promote people, what the criteria, be clear with the criteria, and analyze everybody. That's like firm culture right there. That's not like a separate EDI initiative. The same way with like AI in Minnesota, we're looking at the award kind of like criteria, right? So with an EDI lens, but once that criteria is established, then it's integrated. It's not like a separate thing that, okay, you analyze the projects and then you analyze it from an EDI lens. No, it's like integrated, right? So I think, the work has to be integrated into the culture. Otherwise, yes, people will get fatigued. People will kind of like, why more stuff, right? So I think that's what I would say, that we need to work towards that it's integrated, so.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of like normalization of these concerns, right? Because that does feel different, I think. Just certainly talking about the kind of academic context, I think you can make that argument more now. This is not a separate thing, right? That once you silo it, then it's easy to forget about it, or to then say, oh, check, we did that, and now we're going to move on. I think one thing I do see a lot of right now is there's like a lot of calls for like social justice, like academics, right? Like that you have a kind of focus. And on the one hand, I think that is great, right? But I also think it's another way of like reinforcing a kind of siloing. It's like, actually, everybody should just care about this. This is not like I need to only focus on that topic and limit myself in that way. It's like I can talk about social justice in the context of material flows and climate change, and I can talk about it in the context of like, formal strategy for an architectural installation. Like I can talk about it in a lot of different ways. So I think what you're describing of this kind of normalization within the culture is something that we really need to think about and make sure that that's truly what we're actually doing, and not like actually kind of perpetuating like certain siloing of those ideas.
Yeah, and I think that it's I mean, it's an interesting thing because I mean we've been, sustainability is one of those issues, right? That we recognize needs to just be just an integral part of the way in which we think. Clearly, we're not there yet. We still very much sort of will either have the sustainability consultant or the person in the office who knows who that's their passion project, and so it'll be interesting to see how this sort of unfolds and develops, in the years to come. And so in preparation for today's discussion, I mentioned to everyone on the panel that I went back and took a look at Nilofer Merchant's article, "Culture Trumps Strategy Every Time." It's an article that's sort of well traveled in sort of MBA business circles. It's from the Harvard Business Review, where she argues that sort of the embedded values within an organization are sort of far more potent in determining outcomes than strategic initiatives, right? Like what you are at your core and versus what it is that you say you want to be, or any strategy, those cultural factors will always trump your strategy. They will always come to the fore. And so I really started to think about the ways in which the existing culture within architecture has really hampered, I think, our desire or our ability to diversify the profession, right? And all of there are a lot of obvious things, right? There's the just work all the time, right? That's that's not great for bringing folks into the profession, particularly when, frankly, I think architecture represents a pretty low return on investment, typically. But are there other things, just from your experiences, where you've sort of felt like, this part of architecture culture, I really wish we would change the way we did this, or
I think, changing mindset and unconscious bias, those are the two things that we need to change in our culture. Mindset being, let's say, okay, you work 60 hours and you work 40 hours. The 60-hour person, you must end up with like a better project than a 40-hour, instead of like really looking at their results, but you're looking at the hour. There's a good chance that this 40-hour person is much more effective and productive and efficient, not necessarily he or she come up with like worse results, right? So I think changing the mindset, it's kind of like a result or performance-based analysis instead of like quantity, like 60-hour versus 40-hour, right? So that's one. And then the other one is this unconscious bias. And I think oftentimes I still see it even in some of the women architects, BIPOC architects, that they just assume, they look at a larger firm, they want to like get introduced, then they contact the white male leaders within that firm instead of the women leaders or the BIPOC leaders, you know, with the assumption that the white male leaders have more power than the BIPOC or women, you know? So I think it's kind of like changing that mindset, you know, and being conscious about, you know, how people contribute and not have unconscious biases, you know? So yeah, those are, I think, the two things that as a profession, we need to kind of like change. So.
Yeah, I think we're really hurt still by the idea of, you know, we could call it this architect, we could call it the lone hero authorship voice. It's such a team of people to get anything done anywhere these days for any, you know, scale or project. And, you know, I think that matters in terms of what the public thinks we are and we do, but also like how going to take a firm culture for, you know, everyone in the firm feels valued and part of it. You know, I think to value everyone's work in every way and how it comes together, but somehow also elevate and acknowledge that. I can't go back to the phrase Trevor said, but something, you know, it is about like everyone feeling a part of it in every way. So I think that just a shared authorship and teamwork could help, you know, change the culture of our profession.
Yeah,
I think that would go a long way.
Mhm.
Sorry, Jeff, I didn't mean to cut you
Well,
off.
no, I agree with you that you know, recognizing the value of everyone's contribution. I don't know. I think if you're really sort of like, I'm a values driven person, right? Like it really matters to me, like what the kind of ethos of the place in which I'm situated, like what, you know, what do they believe? What are their values? How am I, you know, sort of right aligned with that or not? And so I think I think your discussion about like culture trumping strategy is like, yeah, the values really do determine the outcomes, because that's the thing that persists. It's like, you know, you're always trying new techniques, new, you know, strategies, new like, but they're growing out of what your values are. So, so I think, you know, that is also the kind of, you know, potentially the really kind of positive silver lining from this moment is that like everybody is going through this process of re-examination or could, right? Like the times could open up that space for that to happen. You know, so it's like, okay, if we value X, what does that actually look like? Right? Like, how are we, you know, dedicating money to that, right? Like resources to it to make sure that it actually is something that's funded, that is like, that is just, you know, always part of our conversation, that it's not siloed, that it's not under-resourced, that it's not XYZ, but it's always present. You know, so I don't know, I feel like that this is an opportunity for people to really think concretely about what it is that they value and are they transmitting that outward? Because I think now also there is external pressure where people are watching to see if that is the case.
Yeah.
And that is one thing that has really changed.
I see that we're running a little low on time, so I'm going to pause here and ask folks if they would to put questions that they may have in the chat, and I can go through and share some of those with the panelists. The first one I see is, what are the pros and cons of being one of only 3 women in a Japanese architecture firm?
We can skip that.
Is that a too long of an answer?
I mean, it is a chance to be the other, right?
Right.
Yeah, it can be a whole other long hour dissect. For me to, you know.
Yeah.
But I really liked how Anna, in some ways in your presentation, you talked about how that outsider position like gives you a different lens and like way of seeing seeing what's in front of you and the value. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't easy, Jody, but
Yeah.
on the other hand,
Yeah, you observe and it's fresh and you get to create what you want of it. So
Yeah, that's often a really interesting position. This one's good. Jennifer, are you finding that there are fewer times when you have to double think your next move as a Black architect in 2021? What have you seen colleagues and clients do to erase that need for you? Oh,
yeah, I don't think the double think is a need. I think it's something that I run headlong up against. It's not like I'm, you know, I think that in some ways, one of the ways that's diminished for me as I've just gotten older and maybe I care a little bit less about like playing so nice, but you know, I think it really, for me, I think I'm always going to have that kind of, you know, outsider position. Like that's like, it's part of how we think about our practice, like this kind of continual questioning, like institutional critique. That's just like kind of part of the way in which I think. So, you know, I think in any context, I'm kind of bringing that with me. Like that's part of my inheritance of like what I bring into the room is like thinking around from a different way of approaching the subject. You know, and I think what has changed is that there are more people who see that kind of perspective as being an asset. You know, I mean, we know like from kind of organizational theory, like more diverse teams, like you get better outcomes, right? Like when you have, you know, a variety of different kind of positions coming to the table, it results in a better product. And so I think, you know, I think I probably care a little bit like less, and then also the world is slowly sort of like trailing and catching up a little bit. And I think I've also tried to kind of, you know, if you think about the earlier conversation about role models, I mean, all those people that I named, they have very different practices and life paths and like what I have carved out for myself. So I think it's also like trying to find my own position within the discipline that feels right for me, that gives me the space to say the things that I want to say and navigate in the way I want to navigate. So yeah, I mean, it's like these little wiggle room, little wiggles.
yeah. But do you think it's less now than it was before? I mean, well, in the sense that there's the aspect of it that you control because you're more comfortable in your skin, let's say. But do you think there's those sort of the instances of where you're placed in these moments has diminished?
Yes and no. I mean, on the one hand, it goes back to something Anna was saying about being in a position of enough like stature to like be able to influence the conversation. So that would be the no. But then the yes is that I'm still part of mainly predominantly white institutions that have a certain level of inertia about you know, their ability to enact change. And so I think that there's always a way in which you're trying to stay true to your authentic self in that situation, right? And not be, you know, only seen as like these sort of siloed categories of your identity. It's like, I'm still a whole person who has like plenty of concerns that are like, you know, not always tied up with race and gender. So I think, you know, there are certainly situations where I feel like I can be the fullness of who I am. And then there are others where I like, yeah, I can see that, you know, maybe things are kind of collapsing to those identities in some regard. So that's why it's a both and. I think it's a yes and a no.
I think we're at time. So we'll let you have the last word there, Jennifer.
Oh, no, that can't be the last word.
That can't be the last word. No.
No.
Jean will take us home.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for being here, especially our panelists and moderator. It was just a delight to hear your insightful comments on a really complex and important issue. So really deepest gratitude to you all. And thank you for everyone else for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists. Thanks for the discussion.
Thank you. Bye.
Great to see you all. Thanks.